He said we were dirt, Dad. Why is he standing there now asking to see the deeds to the entire street? 7-year-old Lily whispered the words, her eyes wide, clinging to the threadbare apron of her father, Dean. The polished, predatory figure of Miles Thorne, the same man who had humiliated Dean yesterday over a forgotten invoice, stood motionless in the dust-filled entrance of the tired auto shop, a Rolls Royce Ghost idling silently behind him. Miles wasn't here for apologies. He held a crisp checkbook and a look that promised complete annihilation. Dean's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a business inquiry. This was calculated destruction. Miles Thorne didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it. His arrival at Thorne Acquisitions was a precisely choreographed event, beginning at 6:00 a.m. sharp, with a single espresso brewed to impossible specifications and the immediate review of his global asset portfolio. He was 42, his suits cut with aggressive precision, his face a mask of calculated indifference that had earned him billions in hostile takeovers. His authority was absolute, enforced by the quiet terror he inspired in his subordinates. Today the target was small, a struggling chain of auto repair shops in the Rust Belt, but the principle was the same. Inefficiency must be purged, and ownership belonged to those who commanded it. By 8:30 a.m., Miles was addressing his executive team, his voice low, steady, and utterly devoid of warmth. He decimated a quarter's projected earnings with 2 sentences and dismissed a CFO who dared to offer an excuse. He viewed weakness as a contagious disease. He had clawed his way to the top, not by innovation, but by recognizing where others lacked the spine to finish the job. He controlled everything, markets, people, outcomes, yet every day, exactly at noon, a private door in his penthouse office closed. He would stand before a framed, slightly faded photograph, a young woman with fierce, kind eyes, holding a small boy's hand. That boy was Lucas, Miles's son, who had lost his life in a tragic accident 10 years ago, an accident Miles felt deeply, irrevocably responsible for. Lucas had loved cars, the greasy, complicated mechanics of them, a passion Miles had dismissed as childish noise, urging him toward finance and legacy. The irony was a constant searing pain. He could acquire entire companies, restructure global debts, but he couldn't buy back the 5 minutes he had refused to spend watching Lucas fix a broken go-kart engine. His relentless pursuit of control wasn't about more money. It was a distraction, a punishing ritual to numb the guilt. He demanded perfection from the world because he hadn't been perfect when it mattered most. When he looked at people like Dean, the struggling single father from yesterday, Miles didn't see resilience. He saw the pathetic vulnerability he despised in himself, the inability to control the chaos of life. That brief, humiliating interaction yesterday, where Dean couldn't even manage a simple delivery schedule, confirmed Miles's brutal philosophy. Sentimentality was a fatal weakness. He closed the photo cabinet, the mask snapping back into place. Time to execute the next move. Dean Miller's world smelled of oil, old rubber, and the metallic tang of exhausted effort. His auto shop, Miller's Reliable, was reliable only in its ability to barely cover the bills. He was 35, looked 45, the lines of chronic exhaustion etched deep around his eyes. Dean was a mechanic of rare talent, capable of diagnosing an engine's death rattle just by the sound of its idle, but talent didn't pay the mounting medical bills for his mother, Clara, who suffered from early-onset Parkinson's. Clara lived in a small, subsidized apartment nearby, and Dean spent every evening after the shop closed making sure her medications were set, her meals were prepared, and her hand was held. His anchor, however, was Lily, his daughter. Lily was bright, quiet, and possessed a startling maturity for a 7-year-old. She often did her homework on a folding chair in the shop's dusty office, her presence the only source of pure light in Dean's grueling schedule. When Miles Thorne had walked in yesterday, mocking Dean's delay in delivering a minor company car component, a delay caused by Dean having to rush Clara to the clinic, Lily had witnessed the cold cruelty. The memory of the billionaire's sneer still burned in Dean's chest. He had apologized profusely, swallowing his pride for the sake of the contract, only to be told he was a prime example of why small, disorganized operations need to be eliminated. Dean moved across the shop floor now, inspecting the lift mechanism. The shop wasn't just struggling due to finances, it was structurally compromised. The old hydraulic lift, which was the backbone of his heavy-duty work, was failing. He had welded and patched it countless times, but the main support beam had developed a hairline fracture, hidden deep beneath the grease and paint. Dean knew, with terrifying certainty, that this critical piece of equipment was days, perhaps hours, away from catastrophic failure. If it collapsed during a job, it could easily cause severe harm or worse. He had begged the bank for a loan to replace it, but his current debt load made him untouchable. He kept the fracture secret, working only light jobs, terrified of the day the truth would explode onto the shop floor. He knew the risk, but he couldn't stop working, not with Clara and Lily depending on him. He felt the cold pressure of Miles Thorne's arrival again, a threat to his livelihood, yes, but more terrifyingly, a distraction from the structural collapse he was desperately trying to prevent. Before we dive deeper into Dean's growing desperation, tell me, where are you watching this story from tonight? Miles Thorne's strategy was simple. Paralyze the target by shock and awe. The Rolls Royce Ghost parked outside Miller's Reliable was the opening salvo. He didn't send lawyers or acquisition specialists. He walked in himself, demanding the books, the leases, the complete inventory list. Dean, still reeling from Lily's initial terrified whisper, could only watch as the billionaire moved through his domain with disdainful grace. Miles didn't touch anything, but his presence contaminated the air, turning the familiar smell of oil into the stench of failure. The crossing of their lives, however, began not with the formal inspection, but with an accidental detail. As Miles, impatiently waiting for Dean to retrieve the disorganized financial ledger, leaned against the counter, his gaze drifted toward the corner. There, surrounded by textbooks and a scattering of crayons, sat Lily. She was drawing, not houses or flowers, but a complicated sketch of an engine block complete with labeled components. It was crude, technically inaccurate, yet vibrant with an understanding of function. Miles felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The drawing was almost identical in its focused, mechanical intent to the sketches Lucas used to make, filling Miles's expensive briefs with fantastical designs for perpetually working machines. He quickly suppressed the memory, dismissing it as irrelevant, but the image lodged itself stubbornly in his periphery. He was here to purchase liabilities and dismantle them, not find ghostly echoes of his past. Dean finally returned, his hands shaking slightly, presenting a battered ledger, bound with electrical tape. "These are the last 5 years," Dean said, his voice flat. Miles didn't open the book immediately. His eyes flickered back to Lily, then to Dean, taking in the cheap suit and the lines of stress. He realized, with a cold clarity that surprised him, that this man, Dean, wasn't just an economic statistic. He was a desperate protector. Miles had seen that look before, in the mirror years ago when he was just starting out, fighting to keep his own head above water. The fleeting recognition only hardened Miles's resolve. He couldn't afford empathy. He needed to be clean, sharp, and ruthless. He opened the ledger, the faint scent of old oil transferring to his pristine sleeve. Lily looked up, her gaze steady, not frightened, but watchful, taking in the full measure of the man threatening their existence. A strange presentiment settled over Dean. The danger wasn't just losing the shop. The danger was already here, hiding in plain sight, and it was tied to the single, fragile thing he hadn't wanted anyone to see, the failing lift that loomed dark and menacing in the far corner. Something was definitely about to break. Miles Thorne spent 2 hours meticulously tearing apart Dean's finances, finding every error, every delayed payment, every structural weakness in the business model. Dean stood silent, taking the brutal assessment. He barely registered the words inefficient and obsolete, because his attention was fixated elsewhere, the main hydraulic lift. He had been distracted by the takeover attempt and hadn't noticed the subtle, sickening sign until now. A delivery truck had pulled into the adjacent bay, a heavy-duty tow rig, far too massive for the dilapidated shop, but necessary for the quick cash jobs Dean occasionally took on. The lift was supporting the heavy front axle, while Dean replaced a worn brake assembly. As Miles detailed the final, fatal offer for the entire property, Dean heard it, a faint, high-pitched ping, a sound distinct from the usual shop noise. He saw a microscopic shift in the grease pattern near the base of the lift's main piston, a movement he recognized instantly as the deepening of the hidden hairline fracture. The metal was stressed beyond its capacity. Miles, oblivious, continued to lecture. "Your operational discipline is non-existent, Miller. You're lucky I'm offering you 50 cents on the dollar just to clear the title." Dean's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a wave of icy panic. The lift was minutes from failure. If it gave way under the weight of that truck, the resulting chaos could injure the apprentice working beneath it, or crash into Lily's makeshift study area. He had to stop the work, but how could he without revealing the structural flaw that would instantly expose him to massive liability, ruining any chance of selling the business and securing his mother's care? He opened his mouth to interrupt Miles's monologue, to scream for everyone to evacuate, but the words choked in his throat. He saw Miles's eyes, cold, judgmental, seeing him as nothing but a failure. If he admitted the lift was breaking, Miles would use it to legally bury him, maybe even press charges. Dean felt the overwhelming conflict: protect his personal solvency or protect the lives he risked by remaining silent. Another louder groan echoed from the metalwork. The apprentice, oblivious, started tightening the last bolt. Dean knew the metal was stretching. He looked at Lily, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes. The cost of silence had just become absolute. He couldn't ignore the signal. Even if facing it meant certain financial ruin, he had to make a move, subtle but immediate, that would stop the work without alerting the predatory eyes of the billionaire. The air in the shop felt thick, pressurized, waiting for the inevitable snap. Dean didn't scream. He didn't denounce the shop's failing structure. He chose a different, desperate approach. Miles Thorne was mid-sentence, outlining the necessary legal clauses for the immediate transfer of assets, when Dean abruptly slammed his hand down on the metal counter, with a force that rattled the nearby tools. "Mr. Thorne," Dean said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the roaring fear in his chest, "I cannot sign these papers right now. I just remembered something critically important about the invoice you complained about yesterday. It wasn't my delay. It was a mistake in your system. I need you to confirm it immediately." Miles froze, his expression transitioning from predatory confidence to sharp irritation. "So you are wasting my time, Miller. That trivial matter is settled. We are finalizing a multi-million-dollar transaction." "It's not trivial," Dean insisted, stepping away from the counter, forcing himself to walk toward the back bay, where the lift groaned ominously. He needed Miles to follow him, to move him and the apprentice away from the immediate blast radius. "It involves proprietary information. Your finance team needs to see this anomaly on my main diagnostic terminal. I believe it shows negligence on your firm's part that could affect the valuation." This was a reckless, magnificent bluff. Miles's attention immediately snapped to the perceived threat to his corporate image. Negligence was an attack on control. "Show me," Miles commanded, his tone dropping several degrees. Dean led Miles away from the lift area, past Lily's desk and toward the back office, forcing the apprentice to stand down from the dangerous equipment to let the billionaire pass. As they walked, Dean deliberately, accidentally, kicked over a rusted jackstand near the lift's hydraulic controls. The stand struck the emergency release valve just enough to partially engage it, creating a near-silent, slow depressurization of the lift. It bought him minutes, but not much more. In the tiny, grease-stained office, Dean brought up a blank screen on the ancient computer. Miles leaned in, suspicious. "Where is it, Miller?" "Just loading," Dean lied, his eyes darting back to the lift. The truck was settling visibly now, slowly, inexorably. The metal was shrieking a silent warning. Dean had risked everything, his deal, his future, his dignity, to move them all away from the physical danger. The silence in the small office was thick with the weight of that risk, Miles's simmering anger, meeting Dean's cold, absolute fear. The entire deal was now suspended on a lie, and the truth of Dean's desperation was inches from collapsing the shop around them. The story had pivoted from corporate takeover to immediate physical survival. Miles Thorne watched the blank screen flicker, a slow burn of contempt hardening his features. "I have no time for games, Miller. There is no anomaly you are stalling." He stepped back, ready to deliver the final, cutting dismissal, when the sound hit them. A monstrous, tearing crack. It was the sound of stressed metal giving way completely. The massive tow rig, which had been gently supported by the lift, instantly dropped 3 feet, smashing onto the concrete floor with a violent, terrifying impact. Dust, grease, and debris exploded into the air. The main hydraulic support beam, where Dean had seen the grease shift, lay bent and twisted like soft wire. Miles Thorne, despite his billions and his calculated distance from chaos, was propelled into primal shock. He realized instantly the magnitude of what had just happened. If that lift had collapsed while the apprentice was beneath it, the resulting catastrophe would have been fatal. Then a chilling understanding dawned. Dean had deliberately pulled him away. The invoice anomaly was a desperate distraction, a lie designed to save lives, not money. Miles's cold indifference shattered, replaced by an acute, visceral memory. 10 years ago, the crash that took Lucas had been a preventable mechanical failure, a signal ignored by a distracted professional. The sudden, violent collapse of the machinery triggered a blinding urgency in him, not of business, but of moral responsibility. He spun on Dean, not with anger about the wasted time, but with furious investigation. "Why didn't you say anything? Why did you risk that collapse?" Dean, breathing heavily, pointed a trembling finger toward the twisted metal. "I tried to get a loan. I couldn't. I was trying to sell you the business to get the money to replace it, and then I saw the fracture expand. I had to get everyone out. I knew you'd use the liability to crush me if I told the truth." Miles didn't flinch at the accusation. He looked at the wreckage, then at Lily, who was frozen by her desk, shielded only by the counter. Miles's executive training took over, overriding the personal shock. He was suddenly operational, assessing risk where human life was concerned. "Call 911. Report a major structural failure, non-injury." He barked at his own security detail, who had been waiting by the rolls. He turned back to Dean, his eyes piercing. "Show me the fracture. Show me the proof you knew. Now." He wasn't looking for proof of fraud. He was looking for proof of Dean's courage, the terrifying integrity that had driven him to sacrifice his only financial lifeline. The corporate acquisition had instantly dissolved, replaced by a frantic mission to understand and contain the real damage, the ethical one. Miles and Dean stood side by side amidst the dust, inspecting the ruptured steel beam of the hydraulic lift. Dean pointed out the nearly invisible dark line radiating from a corroded weld. "It was fatigue, Mr. Thorne. I could only slow it down, not stop it." Miles didn't need to be told the technical details. He understood the economics of it. Dean had sacrificed his shop, his potential buyout, and risked legal exposure, just to buy 2 minutes of time to prevent a fatality. The confrontation wasn't about the collapse. It was about the staggering moral contrast between their two lives. "Yesterday," Miles stated, his voice tight, "I called you dirt. I said your lack of discipline was a reason for failure." He looked away, toward the spot where Lily sat, now comforted by the apprentice. "You were dealing with life and death here, not just late invoices." Dean stood firm, exhaustion replacing the fear. "You look at my life and see inefficiency. I see the only way to keep my mother alive and my daughter safe. Money doesn't buy time, Mr. Thorne. It only buys distractions." The word struck Miles with the force of a physical blow. Money doesn't buy time. It was the mantra of his decade of guilt. He thought of Lucas, the time he had refused to give, the time that was now eternally lost. Miles had spent 10 years using his wealth to crush vulnerability, but here, facing the collapse, Dean's vulnerability was his strength, a fierce protective instinct Miles had abandoned. "My son Lucas," Miles said, the name sounding foreign on his tongue, a truth he rarely spoke aloud. "He was hurt because of a maintenance failure. A cheap part and ignored warning just like this. If you hadn't intervened—" He cut himself off, running a hand over the precise cut of his suit jacket. "You risked everything you had. Why?" "Because there are limits to what you let the world take from you," Dean responded simply. "I might be poor, but I'm not careless with human life." The truth stood naked between them. Miles's empire was built on a lie of total control, shattered by the random, terrifying reality of a structural failure. Dean's life was built on impossible struggle, validated by an uncompromising moment of moral clarity. Miles stared at the wreckage, seeing not a defunct piece of machinery, but the consequence of ignoring the small, crucial details. The contempt was gone. It was replaced by a brutal, self-directed shame, realizing that the man he had mocked yesterday possessed the integrity he himself had lost with his son. The confrontation ended not with a fight, but with a confession, Dean's bravery forcing Miles to finally face his own painful, ignored truth. The consequences were immediate and multifaceted. Dean's act of courage, while saving lives, confirmed the shop's complete inability to operate safely. The moment the structural failure was reported, the city's building safety inspectors swooped in. Miller's Reliable was immediately condemned and red-tagged. Dean lost the last asset he had, the dilapidated building and the machinery within. His attempt to sell the business was finished. The land was now worthless due to the liability. He watched the police tape go up, the physical embodiment of his complete financial ruin. The price of truth was homelessness for his business, and deeper anxiety about his mother's bills. Miles Thorne faced a different, more internal collapse. The shock of the near tragedy forced him to abort the entire acquisition of the auto shop chain. He realized, with sudden, frightening clarity, that the company he intended to buy, Thorne Acquisitions, was operating with the same cold, calculating disregard for human risk that had caused Dean's predicament. He discovered his own due diligence team had deliberately downplayed safety issues across the entire chain to accelerate the takeover. The realization that his company was perpetuating the very environment that cost him Lucas 10 years ago led to a furious internal rupture. Within 48 hours, Miles publicly dismissed his CFO and several senior partners. The shockwave ripped through Wall Street. The meticulously crafted facade of Thorne Acquisitions' stability fractured. He issued a statement citing irreconcilable ethical failures within his executive ranks, effectively sacrificing millions in short-term gains and stability to purge the rot he had finally acknowledged. His public image suffered a severe blow. Investors called him erratic and sentimental. He didn't care. The internal cost was heavy, losing trusted, if ethically questionable, allies and facing the market's wrath. But the greatest consequence was the definitive end of his decade-long delusion of control. Dean, meanwhile, packed the few tools he could salvage from the rubble, Lily quietly watching him. His world had shrunk to a storage unit and the cramped space of his mother's apartment. He had secured physical safety, but paid for it with absolute financial collapse. He sat on an overturned crate, staring at the debris, recognizing the bitter justice of the situation. He had done the right thing, and he had lost everything because of it. Miles, sitting in his silent penthouse, felt the same pervasive sense of loss, realizing that all his wealth couldn't fix the broken trust and the years of moral blindness. Both men were experiencing a profound, painful separation from their former realities. 3 months later, the physical wreckage of Miller's Reliable was gone, but something new was rising from the foundations. Miles Thorne had not walked away. He had returned, not as a predatory buyer, but as a reluctant investor in integrity. He established the Lucas Thorne Foundation, dedicated to funding safety improvements and modernizing infrastructure in small, ethically run businesses across the region. Dean was the first beneficiary. Miles didn't just give him money. He gave Dean the resources to build a new shop, one designed with state-of-the-art safety protocols and certified equipment. He insisted the new business be called the Miller Thorne Safety Center, a permanent public acknowledgement of the lesson learned that day. Dean initially resisted the help, wary of charity, but Miles made it clear, "This isn't charity, Dean, it's a debt. You taught me the value of life over ledger lines. You saved me from becoming the very thing I despised." The new shop was immaculate, efficient, and bustling. Dean, now focusing solely on his mechanical genius rather than financial juggling, finally found dignity. He was paid a fair salary, running the shop he owned outright, free from the crushing debt. Lily, sitting in a proper office nook, still drew complex engine schematics, now encouraged by Miles, who often stopped by, not in the Rolls but in an unmarked, reliable sedan, just to observe. He'd spend 5 minutes watching Dean work, a quiet, almost reverent act of remembrance for Lucas. The greatest transformation was in Miles. He hadn't become soft, but he had become human. He channeled his ruthless focus into ethical investment, choosing moral sustainability over immediate profit. He learned to manage his guilt, not by distraction, but by action, creating a lasting legacy in his son's name. One afternoon, Dean was inspecting the new fail-safe lift system. Miles arrived and handed Dean an envelope containing the final payment for Clara's long-term care, secured and funded. "You saved lives, Dean. That's worth more than any acquisition." Dean looked at the man who had once mocked him, now humbled by his own wealth and finally finding purpose beyond acquisition. They weren't friends, but they shared a profound, unbreakable bond forged in shared fear and redeemed courage. Dean's struggle had ended, replaced by a stable, safe future, proving that true wealth lies not in what you control, but in what you protect. If you enjoyed this story about how true integrity confronts unchecked power, please remember to like this video, leave a comment detailing the moment that surprised you the most, and subscribe to Moonlight Stories for more cinematic tales of transformation and redemption.